Welcome to session 3 of Christianity Explained. In today's session, we're going to talk about the resurrection. I would encourage you, if you haven't already seen, to go back and look at sessions 1 and 2. So today, the resurrection. So we're going to go to the book of Mark chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. This is under Jesus again predicts his death.
They were now on their way up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were filled with awe, and the people following behind were overwhelmed with fear. Taking the 12 disciples aside, Jesus once more began to describe everything that was about to happen to him. "Listen," he said. "We are going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and teachers of religious law. They will sentence him to die and hand him over to the Romans. They will mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, and kill him. But after 3 days, he will rise again."
We're going to talk about why this resurrection is so important and what's actually going on here. Now, Jesus is actually predicting his death. There are a number of times in the Bible where Jesus tells his disciples what's going to happen. He makes a number of predictions here. So first of all, what's happening is this is clearly getting to the end of his ministry. He's had a ministry for about 3 years. He's gained many, many followers. And he has the 12 disciples who are with him all the time. And he tells them, we're going to go back to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem is the capital. It's where his enemies are the strongest. It's where the temple is. And understandably, his disciples and his followers are terrified because they know they're going back into danger. And then Jesus mentions a few things which seems very difficult for the disciples to accept or to understand. He says, the Son of Man, which is how Jesus often referred to himself, will be betrayed. So he knows that one of his friends is going to betray him. He will be betrayed to the leading priests and teachers of the religious law. They will sentence him to die and hand him over to the Romans. Now, in those times, Israel was occupied by the Romans. The Romans were a very brutal and militaristic group, and they covered most of the known world at that point. And because of that, the Jews did not have the authority or the permission to put someone to death. They had to go to the Romans in order to get permission for that to happen, or for the Romans to in fact do it. So that's why the teachers of religious law would need to hand him over to the Romans. And Jesus said, they will mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, and kill him. So this is pretty brutal stuff, and it's a bit sanitized in many respects, probably because in those days that people understood really what was going to happen. The cross was a very brutal and torturous way of dying, very, very cruel. And so was the flogging. Many people didn't actually survive the flogging. So Jesus knows he's going to go through this just terrible trial and this really difficult, painful, horrible death. But then he makes a startling prediction. He says, but after 3 days, he will rise again. He doesn't say in 100 years when no one's around. He says in 3 days, you will know I am who I say I am. I am the Son of God. Interestingly enough, when you think about why the disciples couldn't accept this, if they had been living with Jesus for 3 years, seeing him perform many miracles, heal people, calm storms, bring people back from the dead, recognizing that he is in fact the Son of God, for them to consider that Jesus was going to be brutally murdered was probably something very difficult for them to understand and to accept. Maybe that's why Jesus tells them numerous times this is what's going to happen. Well, let's read about the resurrection itself.
Mark 16, 1-7, the resurrection. Saturday evening, when Sabbath ended, Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James, and Salome went out and purchased burial spices so they could anoint Jesus' body. Very early on Sunday morning, just at sunrise, they went to the tomb. On the way there, they were asking each other, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" But as they arrived, they looked up and saw the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled aside. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man clothed in a white robe, sitting on the right side. The women were shocked, but the angel said, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He isn't here. He has risen from the dead. Look, this is where they laid his body. Now go and tell the disciples, including Peter, that Jesus is going ahead of you to Galilee. You'll see him there, just as he told you before he died."
So the women go to the gravesite to anoint Jesus' body, and there's an angel there that tells them that Jesus is not there, that he is risen, just as he told you he would. You know, there were many occasions after Jesus rose where he appeared to his disciples. In fact, he appeared at one point to over 500 people. But we're going to go to a part now that talks about one of those occasions. So we're going to go to the book of Luke. So you have Matthew, Mark, and then Luke.
Luke chapter 24, 36 to 43. And just as they were telling about it, Jesus himself was suddenly standing there among them. "Peace be with you," he said. But the whole group was startled and frightened, thinking they were seeing a ghost. "Why are you frightened?" he asked. "Why are your hearts filled with doubt? Look at my hands, look at my feet. You can see that it's really me. Touch me, make sure that I am not a ghost, because ghosts don't have bodies as you see that I do." As he spoke, he showed them his hands and his feet. Still they stood there in disbelief, filled with joy and wonder. Then he asked them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he ate it as they watched.
This is interesting because, and it's helpful because Jesus' resurrection was a physical one, not just a spiritual one. He is fully alive, and he appeared to his disciples, and a number of occasions he eats with them. Another occasion he actually cooks a meal for them, cooks some fish on the side of the lake. One of the things that really has convinced me of the truth of the Bible and the truth of these stories is that when you look at when Jesus was crucified, his disciples ran away terrified. They all abandoned him. They hid in various places out of fear that they would be next. And Peter, one of the disciples, actually denied Jesus 3 times. But in a space of a very short period of time, they went from being terrified and hiding to proclaiming Jesus as the Saviour, as the Messiah, as the Son of God. They went boldly in front of rulers and kings. And in fact, because of those disciples, they started the churches that we now worship at and see thousands of years later. There are billions of Christian followers because of the actions of the disciples. So they've gone from being terrified to boldly going out and proclaiming at the risk of their own lives that Jesus is the Son of God. Why would they do that unless it was true? Each of the disciples, in fact, died a terrible martyr's death, with the exception of John, who ended up dying in a prison island, the island of Patmos. He died of old age there, but all the others died a terrible death. So this resurrection is so important because it proves who Jesus was and who he claimed to be. But also, what it does, it gives us a hope of a resurrection ourselves. We know that one day, if we follow Jesus, we too will be resurrected or brought back to life. But what does all that mean? How does that all work? One of the great mysteries of life, I guess, is in fact death. One of the things that mankind has always considered and been perhaps afraid of is death. Maybe it's not so much how we're going to die, but what happens after death. There's a little poem that went something like this, that death itself is nothing, but this we fear. To be, we know not what, we know not where. The Bible actually answers these questions. The Bible tells us what's going to happen when we die. We're now going to go out of the book of Mark and into the book of Acts. So you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then the following book is the book of Acts. Acts stands for the actions of the apostles. So these are the things that happened after Jesus' resurrection. And just to put it in context before we go to the passage, the story here is about Peter, one of the disciples, talking to a man by the name of Cornelius. Cornelius is not a Jew, but he's a God-fearing man, which means he follows some of the traditions of the Jews and that he fears God and he worships God, but he's not a Jew. And Peter goes along to him, and it's really interesting because in those days, Jews did not associate with Gentiles. They certainly would not eat with them because the food that the Gentiles ate was seen as unclean. And in a dream, both Cornelius and Peter had dreams to say you need to meet with each other. And that's what happened. So we pick up the story now in Acts chapter 10, verses 39 to 43.
And we apostles are witnesses of all he did throughout Judea and in Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a cross, but God raised him to life on the third day. Then God allowed him to appear, not to the general public, but to us whom God had chosen in advance to be his witnesses. We were those who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. And he ordered us to preach everywhere and to testify that Jesus is the one appointed by God to be the judge of all, the living and the dead. He is the one all the prophets testified about, saying that everyone who believes in him will have their sins forgiven through his name.
So Peter is saying that Jesus is the one appointed to be the judge of the living and the dead. That's known as Judgment Day. And on that day, all people will be raised and judged. The basis of that judgment will be whether you have accepted Jesus or not. So on that day, people will be divided into two groups. Those that accept Jesus now are accepted by Jesus now and accepted into heaven then. Those that reject Jesus now will be rejected by Jesus then, and they'll be excluded from heaven. And this division lasts forever. It's a very solemn message. No one can make that decision for you. It's a decision that only you can make. And remember in week 1 we talked about, or session 1, we talked about free will. You get the opportunity to choose whether to follow Jesus or not. There's no notion in the Bible about second chances. We have this life, and this life only, to decide to follow Jesus or not. So your attitude to Jesus in this life is the same as his attitude to you in the next. So you accept him now, he accepts you now and in the next life. You reject him now, he rejects you in the next life. We have one more Bible passage to go through, and it's from the book of 2 Thessalonians, chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. They will be punished with eternal destruction, forever separated from the Lord, from his glorious power. When he comes on that day, he will receive glory from his holy people, praise from all who believe, and this includes you, for you believed what we told you about him. Now, we weren't there 2,000 years ago. We weren't eyewitnesses of all the things that Jesus did, but we have eyewitness accounts. They are the apostles. They are the men who were with Jesus for that 3 years, who saw him heal people, saw his amazing teaching, saw him raise people from the dead, do amazing things, calm the storm, and then saw him crucified and 3 days later come back to life. So we believe those eyewitness accounts. And in those accounts, it does talk about Jesus being the judge of the living or the dead on that day, in Judgment Day. And we get a choice. We have free will. So your attitude to Jesus in this life is the same as his attitude to you in the next. So you accept him now, he accepts you now and in the next life. You reject him now, he rejects you in the next life. And that is the end of session 3. So far we've covered the 3 legs of the stool that we have mentioned in each of the sessions. So if you recall, each leg is equally important. Each leg is one of the basic fundamentals of the Christian faith. So Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus, what happened on the cross, and the resurrection, which we've just covered. So if before next session you could read Mark chapters 11 to 16, and that will complete the book of Mark. As usual, underline or write down any questions that you might have, and if you're in a group you can cover that in question time prior to next week. really looking forward to the next 3 weeks. So the first 3 weeks are all about Jesus. The next 3 sessions are all about, well, what does that mean for us now, 2,000 years later? What is a Christian? What do I need to do if I want to be a Christian? How can I know for certain? Look forward to seeing you then.